Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. So good afternoon, everyone. We'll begin. Welcome to the Regional NAP Expo during Climate Change Week here in Yoso, Republic of Korea. We are delighted to be surrounded by actors who are committed to enhancing resilience within their respective communities, countries, and areas of coverage. As we navigate through the sessions of the Regional NAP Expo on the theme, Advancing Financing and Implementation of GGA-aligned NAPs. On behalf of the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, the LEG, I am Tilenam Gill, and I'm honored to moderate this opening session on the Regional NAP Expo. Today, we will hear messages from the LEG, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, and the COP30 presidency on the relevance of the Regional NAP Expo, and we will also look at the overview of the NAP Expo over the coming days. Unfortunately, the chair of the LEG is delayed today due to unforeseen circumstances and should be able to join us starting tomorrow. But we are grateful to be joined virtually by Hana Hamadala, who will deliver the welcome remarks on behalf of the LEG. So we have is Hana online? Okay, she's online. Hana, you have the floor.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ms. Noor Al-Hamidi, Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Alice Amiron, representative of COP30 presidency, representatives of various organizations, programs, and entities, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the government of the Republic of Korea for hosting this Climate Week and for their support in making this regional NAP Expo possible. As we emerge from COP30, there is a clear growing emphasis on implementation and delivery. Recent climate-related hazards and their impacts continue to remind us of the urgency of translating plans to action. Many countries in this region have already articulated their priorities through national adaptation plan. The focus now is increasingly on how to operationalize this plan in a structured and sustained manner. LDC continue to face significant capacity and resource constraints, underscoring the need to scale up implementation support. These include assistance in accessing and managing climate finance, particularly through project and program development, as well as targeted technical support to build institutional capacity and facilitate the transfer of knowledge, tools, and technologies. Ladies and gentlemen, the UNFCCC, through the LEG, published the updated NAP technical guidelines in 2025. These guidelines place a strong emphasis on scaling up implementation and financing, including through identification of project profile and financing plans, promote integrated approaches across interconnected systems, and highlight the importance of coordinated management of actors, finance, institution, data, and action needed to deploy adaptation effectively across systems and scales. Importantly, the guidelines remain flexible and applicable to countries at all stages of their NAP journey. The NAP Expo is the key platform for supporting countries in moving from planning to implementation, while the Global NAP Expo will take place next month in Rwanda. This regional expo provides a timely opportunity to focus specifically on advancing the financing and implementation of GGA-aligned NAPs in the Asia-Pacific region. Through this forum, we can explore practical solutions such as applying risk pathways using NAP to achieve the GGA, advancing on financing and implementation strategies, and coordination of adaptation action for effective delivery and results. The League remains fully committed to supporting countries in implementing their NAP through technical guidance, capacity building, peer learning, and facilitation of access to resources. We look forward to building on the partnership and good practices emerging from this regional expo. On behalf of the League, I thank all participating countries, partners, and organizations for your engagement and commitment. I thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for that warm welcome to our participants and for introducing the rationale behind the Regional NAP Expo and also presenting everyone the opportunity to engage in the discussions around transitioning from NAPs, from planning to implementation ahead of the Global NAP Expo next month in Rwanda. I now invite the UNFCCC Deputy Executive Secretary, Noura Hamlaji, for her opening remarks.
Thank you.
Good morning.
So, it's okay. Thank you and good afternoon to Hannah Hamdallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Colleagues, member of the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, a warm welcome to the NAP Regional Expo. Adapting to climate impacts and building resilience is absolutely vital as global heating decimates communities and economies across all regions, with the most vulnerable hit the hardest. Yet, no country is immune. Everyone is already paying a heavy price, both domestically and through increasingly disrupted and interlinked global supply chain, as we could see for the energy crisis, unfortunately, with the situation happening in the Middle East. In Asia and the Pacific, countries are already experiencing the impact of climate change on water system, on food security, on health, and on ecosystems. These impacts are not only intensifying, they are becoming more complex and interconnected, requiring responses that are integrated and responses that are systemic. The global goal on adaptation under the Paris Agreement gives us a shared direction to reduce vulnerability, to strengthen resilience, and to enhance adaptive capacity. But achieving this goal depends on our ability to translate it into practical projects and policies on the ground that help people where they live in ways that people understand. This is where national adaptation plans, the NAPs, are so critical. More and more countries are putting in place their plans, but it is not the end point. Effective implementation is now crucial. By 2030, countries should have made significant progress in implementing their NAPs. The 2025 NAP Progress Report shows that the foundations are in place. Countries have built frameworks, they have built coordination mechanisms and sectoral priorities for adaptation. Finance is now essential to put these plans to work. This is why spaces like this expo are so important. They allow us to move beyond concepts and to go into the actual concrete practice. By sharing experiences, by identifying solutions, and building the partnership needed to unlock opportunities for resilient and sustainable development. Colleagues, I want to reaffirm that UN climate change stands firmly behind countries in this effort. We are working with the wider UN system to support developing countries in designing and strengthening their NAPs. We are also here to support parties as they navigate the transition from the planning phase to the implementation phase by providing a platform for collaboration, enabling knowledge exchange, and helping connect countries with a broader ecosystem of support. As you engage in today's discussion, I encourage you to think about how your priorities can be advanced through NAPs, how they can be translated into investable projects and tracked in a way that clearly demonstrates progress towards global goal on adaptation. Colleagues, as we all know, this is the era of implementation. Together, let's accelerate action, strengthen collaboration, and ensure that adaptation delivers for those who need it most. I thank you, and I wish you a very, very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Executive Secretary, for presenting the bigger picture of our work on how the individual actions feed into the larger framework for global climate resilience. And thank you for expressing the continued support of UN Climate on helping countries move from NAP planning towards implementation. We hope our participants here, we've heard this, spaces like this is very important to maintain the momentum, that you will use and maximize the space to sustain momentum on adaptation, from moving beyond concepts to practical solutions that yield concrete results. Up next, we will hear from Alice Amorin on behalf of the COP30 presidency through a video recorded remark.
Good morning to you all from Brazil to South Korea. My name is Alice Amorim. I'm Programs Director in the COP30 presidency team, and I want to convey your message on how important adaptation is for us and for the whole climate ecosystem. On the road to Belém, we have put a lot of effort in trying to elevate the adaptation agenda as part of our COP and as part of all future COPs, climate, the biodiversity COPs, and other COPs, because adaptation is everywhere and should be everywhere. But adaptation planning is important. NAPs are a key instrument, as you all know very well, to plan what are the priorities, where should we be focusing on in implementing our NAPs. Ahead of Belém, 87 countries submitted their NAPs to the UNFCCC. We are far from ideal, but it was already a big progress going forward. For us in Brazil, it was a deep learning experience, both in terms of interministerial engagement, in terms of learning what are the trade-offs, what are the challenges in advancing in adaptation, but also in bringing different efforts to engage the civil society, the academia, subnationals, and so on. Now it's time to advance on NAP's implementation. But how do we do that? How can this space in the NFCCC be fit for purpose for that? What Ambassador André Correa do Lago, our COP30 presidency, is saying is that we need coalitions of the willing, we need the negotiation outcomes, we need different instruments to actually move from negotiation to implementation. Implementation of NAPs is very important, and we hope to see coming out of this NAPs Regional Expo solutions that can help us advance going forward. In the COP30 presidency team, last year in Belém, we launched alongside with Germany, Italy, and the UNDP Climate Promise, the NAPs Implementation Alliance. This effort wants to address three main elements or bottlenecks that we see in the way forward on implementation. First, to actually strengthen collaboration amongst different stakeholders, technical assistance providers, financial institutions, developing countries that are interested and are already engaging in the NAP implementation. Second, to help countries advancing from NAPs design to NAPs implementation. through, in particular, its capacity to advance on financial instruments, how to attract investments to implement those NAPs. And third, to advance on private sector engagement on the adaptation agenda and on NAPs implementation. This is a plan to accelerate solutions as part of the action agenda that we hope to see many of you engaging with us, helping us finding those avenues in which we can bring more efficiency and actually speed up urgent action on the ground on adaptation. I hope this Regional NAP Expo is extremely successful, that builds up the agenda and elevates the adaptation agenda going forward, and helps us clarify to the wider world how NAP's implementation is so critical for the implementation of the UAE targets that we all agreed upon at COP28. So we are looking forward to continue engaging now in Bonn, at London Climate Action Week, in New York, at COP31, at COP32, and beyond, to make sure that adaptation is a political priority for everyone. Thank you, and have a lovely day.
Thank you to the COP presidency for their remarks and for their continued leadership following the outcomes of our collective work by parties and partners at COP30 last year in Brazil. At this point, let me thank the Deputy Executive Secretary for being here at the opening of the Regional NAP Expo, as she has many other engagements. Having heard these inspiring messages, I will now direct your attention to the overview presentation of the Regional NAP Expo, to be presented by Sonam Khandu from the Secretariat. Sonam.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the LDC Expert Group, I'm very glad to be making this overview presentation on the Asia-Pacific Regional NAP Expo, which focuses on advancing financing and implementation of GGA-aligned NAPs. Sorry, the clicker is a bit, yeah, okay. As most of you are aware of the two objectives of the process to formulate and implement NAPs, just reiterating it here, it is to reduce vulnerability to the impacts of climate change by building adaptive capacity and resilience, and to facilitate the integration of climate change adaptation into policies, plans, and programs. I would like to present an overview of NAPs that have been submitted to the UNFCCC. We have so far 76 developing countries that have submitted NAPs, of which 27 are LDCs and 15 are SIDS. Specifically for this region, we have 28 countries in the Asia-Pacific that have submitted NAPs, of which 22 are from Asia and 6 are from the Pacific. And this includes 7 LDCs and 7 SIDS. We also have 12 developed countries that have submitted their NAPs and climate adaptation strategies to the UNFCCC. And there are also some countries that have submitted sectoral NAPs, such as those for agriculture, for health, and other sectors. As you all may recall, in 2023, through Decision 2 CMA 5, there was a decision that called on parties to have their NAPs in place by 2025 and to have progressed into implementing them by 2030. So in terms of the progress being made, countries have made significant progress in identifying adaptation priorities through their NAPs. They have documented sectoral and subnational priorities. They have vulnerability assessments and also aligned their NAPs with the national development goals. However, there are still gaps that remain, and one of the key gaps are priorities that have not yet translated into project pipelines or programmatic frameworks or adaptation portfolios that financing actors can directly engage with. And this has resulted in a persistent disconnect between what NAPs are actually saying and what gets funded and implemented. So the Regional NAP Expo has been designed to address this gap, and we will work through 6 technical sessions that will try and support countries in translating their NAPs from planning to implementation. The sessions designed for the Expo applies the updated NAP technical guidelines that were launched last year, where it emphasizes on the NAP as the overall adaptation strategy and policy anchor for the whole of society, where NAPs aggregate sectoral, subnational, and local priorities into actionable and investable policies, programs, and projects. The guidelines also show a strong emphasis on implementation strategy, financing, and structuring investment-ready action. It aligns with the GGA framework targets and is informed by the IPCC AR6 best available science, and it also manages both climate risk and adaptation benefits as complementary approaches. In terms of the framing of the different sessions, it goes through the cycle whereby we start from the GGA framework targets to implementation. So how we see it is as, in terms of the framing, is having the GGA framework targets, setting the direction of where countries need to be heading, with the billing adaptation indicators measuring that distance, and the risk pathways revealing what could go wrong, the adaptation functions that would address the systemic consequences, and addressing and identifying adaptation priorities to that effect, and solutions that would be defined on how to package those different interventions so that countries actually develop an adaptation portfolio, which is basically a mix of programs, projects, and readiness needed to achieve results. It will also have a session on deployment architecture, focusing on financing and implementation, and a session that has an adaptation orchestration, which is basically coordinating action so that it's effective in delivery and in resulting in outcomes. The last session would be on the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, using the Belling adaptation indicators to close the chain of measuring the distance in terms of where countries are towards meeting the objectives of the GGA framework. So this is again basically just describing it into the 6 sessions that we have over the course of the 3 years. With 3 days, 3 days of the Expo. What I've just explained earlier in my earlier slide, it summarizes the 6 sessions, and then I'll go briefly over each of these sessions in my next slides. So it's following the logical chain of our adaptation, as I mentioned, starting from the GGA targets and working through the different sessions into the monitoring, evaluation, and learning system. This is the overview program for the Expo. So we're starting today with the opening, and then we'll have this followed by the session on the GGA targets and indicators, and the risk to response session until 6 p.m. today. And tomorrow we start again at 2 p.m. with a session on why adapt and using NAPs to achieve GGA, followed by a session on financing and implementation. The last day for the Expo is on Saturday, and again the sessions will start at 2 with a session on adaptation orchestration, followed by the MEL system and the closing of the regional NAP Expo. So just to quickly touch on each of the sessions very briefly, in case you're interested, the details we will provide on the web pages. So session 1.2 is on the GGA targets, indicators, and risk pathways, where we will introduce the UAE framework of global climate resilience and its thematic and dimensional targets. So this session will follow right after this closing. After the tea break, we'll have a session on the risk pathways, which traces how climate hazards can materialize into systemic consequences across the GGA targets, and participants will be engaged in building risk pathways and understanding what it means to develop risk pathways. Tomorrow, we'll have a session that on why adapt, so looking at adaptation in terms of the GGA framework and how the NAPs can be used to operationalize the GGA targets. This will be followed by a session on financing and implementation, where we will bring together country participants as well as support providers. We'll have the climate funds, the MDBs, and UN organization, and countries will have the opportunity to engage with them directly through a World Cafe format and discuss portfolio propositions in order to see what kind of support is available for NAP implementation. On the final day, we'll have this session on adaptation orchestration, whereby we try and present that having a NAP itself is not enough. In order to have effective delivery, in order to have the right outcomes, we also need to be engaging the whole of society. We'll need to coordinate information, data. So that session will be covering that aspect. And the last session will be on the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, where we'll have a session of peer learning and aligning national MEL systems with the indicators. So we hope that this very interactive design of the Regional NAP Expo will allow participants to bring their own country context and also for the partner agencies to be able to bring their expertise and interact with each other. We'll have a lot of group exercises, world cafes, plenary discussions. So we really hope that we will be able to draw on all your experiences, all your interest, and have a very interactive and fruitful sessions for the Expo. So the expected outcomes is to have an increased uptake of the latest NAP guidance, which includes the updated NAP technical guidelines. Of course, a very strong focus on implementation, financing, and the organization of adaptation priorities, practical tools and frameworks applied during the sessions, as well as concrete follow-up actions and partnership opportunities. So we hope that the discussion doesn't end here and that it continues beyond the Regional Expo. So on logistics, so the Regional Expo, we understand, is a bit far from the main Expo venue, but at least we will have the same room for the next 3 days, and it is taking place every day from 2 to 6, today, tomorrow, and on Saturday. And we will include all the session-relevant materials in terms of slides, presentations. All of that will be available through the webpage with the QR code presented here. So we hope that you can have that information with you once you attend the sessions. And I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonam, for that comprehensive presentation on the program and highlight of the key focus of our work for the week under the Regional NAP Expo with the theme for advancing financing and implementation of GGA-aligned NAPs. This concludes the opening session, and we now will proceed to the next session. So invite everyone to the next session, the technical session, which begins on GGA targets and indicators, which is taking place right here in this room, so don't go anywhere. Thank you all for your participation, and in the interest of time, I hand over immediately to colleagues Tiffany and Carlos.
Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Tiffany van Ravenswaay, and I will be your moderator for this session. I am a member of the Adaptation Committee, and I'm also a climate advisor at the Alliance of Small Island States, and I'm happy to be here with you. I'll quickly go into the introduction of our session. So our session is on session 1.2 on GGA targets and indicators. This session will build on ongoing work under the GGA, including the targets under the UAE framework for global climate resilience and the indicators under the UAE BELEM work program. So the purpose and the focus of this session is to move from understanding to application in national context, including how these targets and indicators can support risk assessments and prioritization, planning and implementation, and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. As reflected in recent CMA outcomes, parties are encouraged to test and apply the indicators and to share experiences and lessons learned. This session aims to contribute to that process, including identifying methodological needs and areas of support. And the format for this session will be first a short presentation by the Secretariat, so Carlos, and then the second will be targeted interventions from speakers, and then we'll have a moderated interactive discussion. So now I would like to hand over to, or invite Carlos from the Secretariat to introduce the GGA targets and the indicators. Carlos, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear moderator. So I'm Carlos Ruiz-Garbia and work at the UNFCCC supporting the work of the Adaptation Committee. So it's a really a great pleasure to be here. And I would like to start the presentation maybe mentioning and presenting some of the highlights of the work of the LEC, but also the work of the Adaptation Committee. I will present the GGA and indicators in three main parts. First, I will discuss the evolution of these elements within the context of the adaptation architecture. We'll then give more information on the global goal on adaptation. And the last segment is more on the next steps and what is expected moving forward. If you can please display the presentation. So the first segment, I will be giving information on the background. So just bear with me a little bit. And thank you so much. So this is a nutshell that summarizes 30 years of the evolution of the adaptation architecture. So the UNFCCC has evolved significantly over these past 3 decades. You may recall the session at COP28 in Dubai, where the AC launched a publication called the 30 Years of Adaptation. So this slide tried to summarize some of these key milestones. It's very important to start back 30 years ago, where actually in the early phase, the focus was more on understanding risks and vulnerabilities, but with a very limited institutional support. Then the transition moved into expanding elements in terms of planning and pilot implementation, some implementation exercises, including the establishment of the funds and the support mechanisms, particularly for LDCs. Back in 2010, you may recall the Cancun Accords and a more structural system emerged back then in Cancun, including the national adaptation plans and the establishment of constituted bodies like the Adaptation Committee. And today, under the Paris Agreement, now we have a very comprehensive forward-looking framework that is anchoring a strong emphasis on implementations, finance, and measurable progress. So the key takeaway here of the slide is that we have moved for assessing risks to planning to a full-scale implementation accountability as well. So this next slide provides a nutshell picture of the evolution of the global goal on adaptation. So we are trying to mimic here in a collection of points that follows the Talanoa structure. The Talanoa dialogues started from understanding the foundations, then we will move into understanding what does it take to get there, how do we get there, and what does it look like, so how do we know where that is, and finally, of course, the ultimate objective, where do we need to go. So with that logic, then the current system that we have in the screen can be interpreted as a multi-layer and interconnected. So coherence, interconnections are key elements of this architecture design, and it combines the global guidance, national systems, finance, and the means of implementation and actors that are included in the right side of the slide at all levels. It's also important to flag that you can see the National Adaptation Plan, the planning phases through various instruments within the Convention and the Paris Agreement, also includes elements of policy, science, investments, and this aligns to a number of reporting instruments. You'll see the overall architecture also contains and defines the trajectories and the direction to the global goal on adaptation, and in between the key elements that will be the focus of my presentation today, including the UAE framework for global climate resilience. That includes, of course, the thematic targets, the indicators, but also some other cross-cutting considerations, including sources of information. So that is the logic that will be followed during the next slides. So this slide provides a little bit of a nutshell of the past few years where the milestones have been agreed by parties, decided by parties. So you may recall 2015, the landmark of the Paris Agreement, where the global goal on adaptation was included in 7.1. This article calls to the enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. And this was followed in 2023 by CMA-5, where the adoption of the UAE framework for global climate resilience. I mentioned already the 7 thematic targets and 4 dimensional targets that we will be discussing later on. In 2024, CMA-6 agreed on the Baku adaptation roadmap that institutionalized a number of elements for the operationalization of this framework and provided the guidance and criteria to enable the implementation of the negotiations of the indicators. So at Belém, CMA-7 2025, you witnessed the adoption of the Belém adaptation indicators with a set of 59 indicators, but also the decisions that establish the Belém Addis vision on adaptation. I will be providing more details on this, and the first phase of the Baku adaptation roadmap, that is for the period 2026-2028. So let me introduce the key elements of the UAE framework for global climate resilience. So the slide tried to summarize the different components, but it's very important to connect this framework to the achievement of the global goal on adaptation, and this helps reviewing and accommodating the progress in adapting to climate change, so all the adaptation efforts globally. And this is a forward-looking framework that contains indicators that are designed to measure progress towards targets for achievements by 2030 and progressively beyond. So at the center of the slide, you see the 7 thematic targets. I can mention a few of them that are part of this package, like agriculture, health, culture, heritage, and the others that you see in the screen. On the right side, you identify the dimensional targets. They are very much aligned with the cycle of the adaptation elements and with the indicators connecting both the thematic themes and the dimensional targets. You see also that very important in this design includes elements on cross-cutting issues, gender, participatory, transparent, human rights. We will learn some good progress on these angles, as well as other elements like LCIPP or adaptation various approaches. MOI, of course, at the center with finance, technology, and capacity building, and other resources or instruments within the UNFCCC processes, particularly in the context of the enhanced transparency framework. Now, let me move to the core part of this presentation. So the idea here is to give you more details of the targets. So maybe without going into all the details, it's very important to note that this includes most of the relevant sectors of society. These 7 sectors actually are very comprehensive. One of the very interesting approaches of this decision is that they contain a sort of integrated elements. And I give you an example. If we just choose, for example, agriculture, food, and nutrition, you will read that the target is to attain climate-resilient food, agriculture, production, and supply and distribution of food, but it also connects to other elements. For example, increasing sustainable and generative production, that is already an add-on, and it also covers other elements that are very much connected to well-being, to just transition or just elements, but also to equity or elements that, for example, here in the last part of the sentence calls for equitable access to adequate food and nutrition for all. So there are very strong elements in terms of the quality of the elements to make these targets feasible. And this applies across the 7 thematic targets. As I mentioned before, there are also the dimensional targets. This follows the circle of the adaptation efforts from the logic design of understanding the impact, vulnerability, and risk assessments, moving to planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So from my colleague, you learned that this week we will be navigating the progress and the ideas to move forward with the NAP 3.0, but also we will be discussing a lot about how this connects to implementation and at the end of the week on the MEL elements. So now I'd like to move to diving into the negotiating elements of the indicators. So you probably recall that CMA5 in Dubai established the UAE work program on indicators under the guidance of the SBA chairs. So first of its kind, establishment of a group of technical experts were convened to lead this work. A number of 78 experts were part of the exercise, and the initial list covers and range from a number of around 9,000 indicators that then were combined to almost 500, and then with an expert list of 100 published in September 2025. And then you witness the evolution of the Belém decisions where parties provided views on indicators and adopted a list of 59 indicators in Belém. So that's the number that we have currently in the system. And there are specific notes to these indicators. So these are forward-looking, focusing on progress towards targets rather than past baseline. So it enables the foresight methodologies. They are party-defined optimal scenarios at the reference point. So you have the directions, the pathways through the thematic targets, and then the help elements to capture the level of resilience and adaptive capacity needed to achieve the global adaptation goal. It's very important also to understand the country party-driven elements on disclaimers and disaggregation. So I won't read the slide. You will have this circulated, but in a nutshell, this highlights key safeguards and flexibility in the use of these indicators. So they are voluntary in nature, non-prescriptive and country-driven, and they are not meant for comparison, nor for creating additional reporting burden. So these are very important disaggregation and disclaimer elements for parties. Importantly, they are not linked to access to finance, and at the same time, indicators can be disaggregated to reflect national context and priorities. So this is a nutshell of the maybe mapping out of the 59 elements. This slide will show the profiles of the adopted indicators. You can see them adopted as per the thematic targets and also the dimensional targets. So you see that here water, health, and impact assessments are strong, but other areas such as infrastructure, poverty are also represented through the fewer indicators. Overall, you notice that this reflects an effort to ensure comprehensive yet focused coverage across adaptation priorities. So just to come to the closing of this presentation, very important to visualize the next steps that follows the adoption of the indicators. Here, it's important to recall decisions where parties are encouraged to test the indicators in consultation with the stakeholders. So this session will be very much looking at the efforts and initial lessons learned along this line. The 2-year Belén Addis work program process will also focus on policy alignments and technical improvements, and there is where the EC and the LEG has a role to play to help and assist countries and also the technical assistant infrastructure to advance with methodological developments, and this work will be led jointly by SAFTA and SBI, and then you will see the implementation of this on the upcoming negotiating platforms. Results will be brought forward for consideration at CMA 9. So that concludes my presentation. The purpose was to set the scene on what constituted the GGA, the UAE framework, and the set of indicators adopted at Belén. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Carlos, for that very comprehensive presentation and also setting the scene for our next element of our session, which is now the targeted intervention. So I would like to invite our speakers, Mohammed, Ramchat, Paulino, Nicholas, and Julie to the stage to get into that targeted session. Thank you. All right. Welcome, everyone. So each speaker is invited to provide a brief intervention of 2 to 3 minutes, and they will focus on one key message and, where possible, a concrete example. So the first speaker is Mohammed from Maldives. So we're now going to start with the country's perspective. And we have 2 targeted questions for you. And the first one is, how are GGA targets being considered or integrated into national adaptation planning processes, including NAPs? And the second question is, what challenges are encountered in applying indicators in national contexts, particularly in SIDS? So over to you, Mohammed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the organizers for giving me a seat to participate in this panel. Thank you so much. So when it comes to the GGA targets being considered and integrated into national adaptation planning processes, we are currently developing our national adaptation plan, so it gives us an edge to actually integrate the GGA targets and its indicators during our development process. So it lightens the amount of work which we would need to do after the plan is being developed. So the first thing that we work on is integrating the updated guidelines to integrate GGA into the NAPs. So we emphasize measurable resilience outcomes within it. And as the government is currently developing the national adaptation plan, our strategic focus areas, we have the coastal resilience, water security, infrastructure adaptation, and ecosystem-based adaptation in summary. When we look at GGA targets and the indicators themselves in integration, looking at resilience metrics, we are working to define adaptation indicators in the GGA to downscale them into a local context, into local levels, such as reduced vulnerability of communities and ecosystems is an example and one of it. And when we design and integrate these resilience metrics, it's very community driven. So all our adaptation work, which we have been doing for many, many years, they are very, very community driven. So we consult with the community firsthand on what problems are occurring. Then we look at possibilities of adaptation solutions, and then we look at we'll be referring that to the GGA indicators, and then we see how we can integrate them in the adaptation processes. And the next thing is financing mechanisms, of course, is very important, and efforts are underway on our side to apply for funding projects, GGA-aligned projects, especially to the Green Climate Fund and other sources as well. The next thing is we need to build capacity in working with GGA indicators as well. So training and institutional strengthening, we are working on it to ensure that adaptation planning is not only top-down but also community-driven. So we keep community-driven efforts constantly as much as possible. And coming to this next question, looking at what challenges are encountered in applying indicators in national context, the first thing is data limitations. So we have a lot of climate data which is sparse because we lack long-term high-resolution data sets on climate impacts. So it's becoming a challenge. It is a challenge for us to track adaptation progress. But we are continuing to engage internationally in order to enhance climate data. The next thing is monitoring gaps. So this is due to limited technical infrastructure, which hinders systematic monitoring of resilience indicators. And the next thing is we do have to depend on external sources. So relying on international data sets, means local nuances are missed. But then again, as I highlight these limitations, we are actively working with the international community and local partners to enhance these efforts. Capacity constraints, again, I've highlighted this before. We have limitations in institutional capacities, human resources, and financial constraints. And another thing is contextual relevance, so global versus local mismatch. So for an example, indicators designed for larger economies often fail to capture the realities of small islands. So sometimes it becomes a bit of a challenge for us to downscale certain indicators to the national context, because I'm pretty sure everyone here would understand that national circumstances would be different in each country, and when we try to downscale it, we would have to reflect on that specific challenges and the state of the country and the economy itself. Sectoral specificity is another thing. So small island development states like us, the Maldives, we need indicators tailored to critical sectors like fisheries, tourism, and coastal protection. Community-level adaptation is something that the Maldives wants to really, really strengthen, so that indicators often look local, informal resilience practices that are vital in SIDS. For the last bit, I would highlight integration challenges. We see fragmented approaches in this. Adaptation efforts are often project-based and short-term, making it hard to establish consistent indicators. So it is a challenge that the Maldives and other SIDS also face, that once we establish a foundation within adaptation projects, then following on, it's difficult for us to carry forward due to mentioned limitations and challenges. Policy alignment. we have difficulties in harmonizing national adaptation plans with global GGA targets. So a lot of us have it, but as in the context of the Maldives, policy alignment is actually, we are able to work through it because we are in the development phase of our national adaptation plans. So during the development phase, we are doing our best to consult with the community, along with the GGA indicators to make it easier for us. As we finish the adaptation plan, these indicators are integrated along with the thoughts of the community. And the last thing is cross-sectoral coordination is very important for us, which is also a challenge. So it gives limited ability to integrate indicators across environment, economy, and social systems. So for us to be able to use the GGA indicators, even at a national level, all the sectors need to come together to one table and to come to an agreement on how we would apply and move forward with these indicators in a local context. So again, it's a lot of discussions, it's a lot of policies involved, and of course there's a lot of politics involved as well. So it is very important that countries like us, small island developing states, we drive ourselves as much as we can and strengthen the community so that, because at the end of the day, we design policies, the government designs policies, and the communities are the ones that will actually implement these activities at the ground level. So their integration in this process is very important, and we would ensure that that coordination is strengthened moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that perspective from bringing the global goal and its targets and indicators into actually how it works on the ground, into countries' perspectives, and also integrating the updated NAP guidelines, and also the emphasis on community-driven adaptation, which is also really good. And also highlighting the gaps and challenges that comes with it, especially when it comes to data, monitoring, capacity, finance, and also the sectors and so on. I'll quickly move on to Ramchat, because we're running low on time. Let me now turn to the cross-cutting dimension. So we also have two questions for you. So the first question is, how can the GGA targets and indicators reflect human rights, equity, and inclusion, including for vulnerable groups? And the second question is, what considerations are needed to ensure participatory and people-centered approaches? So over to you, Ramchat.
Thank you, Lima Stephanie, and thank you for the UNFCCC and adaptation team for having UN Human Rights Office joining this really important conversation. From our office perspective, we are UN Human Rights Office, so GGA targets and indicators can reflect human rights, equity, and inclusion by going beyond the aggregate progress and helping us to understand who benefits from the adaptation, who is still being left behind, and whether adaptation is reducing vulnerabilities in a fair and inclusive manner. So the adopt decision already gives a strong basis for this by emphasizing gender, human rights, intergeneration equity, and social justice, and of course the participatory and fully transparent approaches. So first consideration is therefore disaggregation. The adopt indicator expressly allow the contextual disaggregation, including by gender, by age, disability, race, indigenous peoples, migrants, and also children and young people. So this is essential if the indicators are to reveal the inequalities rather than hide from behind the national average. A second consideration is to ensure that the indicators are linked to people's lived life realities and human rights outcomes. In this regard, it is encouraging that the adopted BLM indicator already include elements such as the equitable access to adequate food and nutrition, access to mental health and psychosocial support, and for populations and also access to social protection in the climate vulnerable areas, and adoption planning that is gender responsive and informed by indigenous traditional and local knowledge systems. So these are important entry points for making the GGA people center. And on the second question, ensuring participation and the people-centered approach require attention not only on what is measured, but it's also how the data is produced and used. OSCHR has developed and recommend a human rights-based approach to data, guided by 6 principles: participation, disaggregation, self-identification, transparency, privacy, and accountability. These principles help ensure that monitoring supports informed, transparent, and accountable decision making, and including for indigenous peoples, women, children, persons with disabilities, and rural communities. In practical terms, this means that we have to use the indicators and data systems that make people visible, especially those in vulnerable situations. And this means that the affected communities should be involved throughout the data and policy cycle. The relevant authority, like National Statistical Office and relevant institutions, should be supported to produce quality data, and methodology should remain foreseeable and adaptable for national context. In conclusion, we really value these GGA targets and indicators adopted and built by LEM, and whether they help make the adaptation more fair and inclusive and more accountable to the people that's most affected by climate change. We have the relevant, as I mentioned, the human rights-based approach to the data and a guideline to adopt human rights into the GGA. So we will share with the Secretariat for dissemination further. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Ramchat, and thank you very much for highlighting the importance of going beyond the aggregated data, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable groups, and why are we doing this, who are we doing this for, and these are the ones that are also mostly affected by it as well, and making it people-centered, and also consider the gender considerations, and also people with disabilities, and also from a human rights based perspective, and also accountability to these people as well. So I'll now move over to Paulino, and that he will give us a regional perspective. So we also have 2 questions for him, which are, how can regional institutions support countries in applying GGA indicators, for example, through climate services and data systems? And what are the key gaps in data methodologies and technical capacities? So over to you, Paulino.
Thank you very much, moderator, and also let me appreciate UNFCCC Secretariat and also Adaptation Committee members for giving us this opportunity to be part of this great panelists. I'm Paulino Umai. I work for IGPAC, which is IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Center, which is a specialized institution of Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which is a regional economic bloc for Eastern Africa. It's one of the regional economic bloc for Africa continent. So IGPAC based in Nairobi, basically we mandated to provide climate services into 11 countries, Sudan, South Sudan, then going up to Tanzania, 11 countries. But the membership of IGAD are 8 countries. So because climate has no border, we have Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi are part of our climate services. So looking into the nature of our work, how we are able to demonstrate type of services we are providing to the countries, member state, and also from the regional perspective, also contributing into the global agenda, because we are regional climate, WMO, World Meteorology Organization, Regional Climate Center. Therefore, we are also contributing at the regional, then also global agenda. Therefore, first of one, our line for us able to help countries in providing climate services on a weekly basis, on 10 days, monthly, also seasonal, which is 3 months, 4 months, then also annual climate services. Then we translating them also into the long-term climate change scenarios in terms of using the model simulation and projection, where now we're able to translate the data from model into indicators in terms of the climate risks, whether it's extreme heat, drought, flood, or other extreme climate event, which is also very, very important in the measuring adaptation indicators, which also presented by colleague Carlo. If you look at the nature of these 59 indicators, all of them anchored on the extreme climate event, and this extreme climate event need a data set. Therefore, we as a regional climate center, we have a platform for us able to demonstrate our services into countries. So I want to give 3 of them to show how we're able to help countries in terms of advancing the climate agenda. One of the platform, which is also coordinating through WMO, is a Greater Honor Africa Climate Outlook Forum. This forum, normally we organize this forum every 3 times per year for us able to give the forecast for next 3 months, next 4 months. So instead of just giving a forecast, how the weather or climate going to look like in next 3 months, how this climate going predicted in next 3 months, what going to do in translating the climate information into impact-based early warning for you able to measure the impact through developing a threshold and triggers, which is also a very important for you able to measure the adaptation goal or indicators in general based on the target. Then again, also at the regional level, we're able to harmonize the countries, the way they are developing indicators for this indicator to be at least harmonized at the country level, not only indicator for the one country. Once we are serving 11 countries also, we're able to demonstrate how we're able to harmonize these indicators in a level, all of them can be measurable. And then also integrating data system across sectors or socioeconomic sectors like agriculture, water, health, and also even if looking from the perspective of settlement, all of them, the key sectors where now they're affected by climate and the level of vulnerability is very high. Then therefore, this climate service is also able to advance the agenda of country for them able to reduce the risk, for them able also to improve in terms of the resilience and adaptive capacity, which is also main pillar of global goal on adaptation in that perspective, which is also achieved through the GACOF. The another pillar also in terms of building capacity, because when we are providing climate services on weekly, on 10 days, also we are building capacity of countries for them able to provide timely, accurate climate information. Because this climate information, if it's not accurate, also these indicators we are going to apply, maybe also we are not going to get it correct. Then for you able to predict hazard, you should have also the capacity for you able to use technology as mean of the implementation of GHA. Then also you are able to build capacity of countries, then the benefit will come back in a loop. Then also the tracking indicators into the decision, because not just only producing information, but this information, are we able to build our decision based on this information or just producing? Because by end of process, the target and indicators, if these indicators, they are not able to lead us into the action in terms of measurable, then by end of process, we are not progressing. Then looking into also challenges related to gaps, because by end of process producing this climate information or helping countries also come with some gaps. Those gaps also could be summarized in terms of the gaps related to data. If you look at a country like South Sudan, where I come from, you find we have a network of 5 synoptic stations, which is also not enough for you able to give more accurate climate information in the past and also in the future for you able to advance or validate the model. So the gap related to observation also could affect directly or indirectly the quality of information you are producing. Therefore, the observation network, although it's a challenge, but also we're able to complement those information using remote sensing in terms of satellite data can be blended also with the number of stations, even if it's not enough. Then also, from that perspective, translating it into the socioeconomic sectors data set where you're able to measure impact, whether is impact in terms of the losses because of the climate extreme event. Sometimes it's find it difficult for you able to translate them into a question. Which type of losses been avoided because of this information being provided? Because by end of process, we want to measure it. We manage to avoid losses in which term in that perspective, which is also very important. Then also in terms of the methodology being applied for you able to produce climate information, sometimes you find difficult for you also to measure the resilience. Even when we talk about the resilient adaptive capacity, countries are facing a lot of challenges for them able to give a measurable definition to apply it. So sometimes just become theories and what being used and also thematic areas not able to be measured in that perspective, where now we as the regional entities, we are able to contribute in that perspective. Then again, also on capacity building, where now you find sometimes like now if you use the model simulation or projection, non-climate practitioners, difficult for them to translate this complicated data set in different format into the information can be utilized by humanitarian agencies. So we as a regional climate center, we are able to build the country's capacity for them able to use this type of technology, and also translating this information into something we name it normally impact-based tools in terms of translating this information into impact. And then we have a platform to do that called multi-hazard early warning, where now we're able to integrate socioeconomic data and also climate data for you able to take action based on it. Then again, also issue related to baseline. So for example, you are talking about a percentage of people being affected by flood. You are basing it on which baseline in that perspective also is another challenge. So in that perspective, we're able to see which type of baseline we are talking about. Then for us able to see how we manage to overcome increasing or decreasing, we're able to evaluate about ourselves based on that baseline.
If I can ask you to wrap up a little bit.
Yeah, so in 1 second, all this information can be linked together in terms of information pulled together. Then you can say, I have integrated system where you are talking about the data. You are moving from a data perspective into methods in institution and also decision and action taken based on it from the data up to action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulino, and also for bringing that regional perspective and the importance of regional centers and how they translate their data into indicators, especially when it comes to risk and vulnerability and also climate impacts, and also how they give scenarios such as, the WMO. I'll now move over to our last two speakers, and I'll ask them to keep it within 3 minutes. Sorry, this is the disadvantage when you're going as the last two. So I'll hand over to Nicholas, who will give us the investment and implementation dimension. So we also have 2 questions for him. The first question is, how can GGA targets and indicators be translated into investment-ready adaptation pipelines at national level? And the second question is, what are key barriers and enabling factors in moving from data and indicators to bankable adaptation projects? Over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you so much. Hi, colleagues. My name is Nick Taylor. I lead the Adaptation and Resilience portfolio for the Global Green Growth Institute. We're based here in Korea, in Seoul. So we usually sit within ministries of environment or ministries of finance, sometimes in both. So often when we're developing NAPs, developing any kind of adaptation work, we're doing it involving as much as possible those two ministries primarily. So the finance lens is kind of what we're really starting with, partly because we also do a lot of work in the green financing mechanism space, green bonds, debt for nature, that kind of thing. So we're often looking at that kind of broader macroeconomic opportunities, and then also looking at the project context. So very briefly, translating translating the GGA down into projects. I guess I don't know, I may be stating the obvious thing here, but I guess we're all still familiarizing ourselves with the metrics and how to use them. For me, it's, when we sit and we have NAP conversations, quite often we're starting off at a very unsatisfactory or broad statement, such as improved drought resilience in agriculture, for example. That's the strategy level discussion that we often find ourselves with, and that's very hard to prioritize. That's very hard to understand where, right? So the data and the metrics that will flow now from the use of the GGA, and I think it's really, I would just like to say also congratulations to the colleagues that have been working on this for many years. I'm not a negotiator. I've not been sitting in the rooms, but I think it's such a useful basis for us all now. It's such a fantastic basis for us to develop real bankable and real impact on the ground. So we're now able to say, this is a system, right? We're saying we're not just building drought resilience in agriculture, we're building a risk assessment that identifies drought hotspots. We have planning indicators requiring mainstreaming. We have implementation indicators. We have MEL indicators. And these things need to then be strung together into that impact storyline, right? Which is where we get the attention of the private sector, and when we get the attention of the MDBs, etc. So that's obviously a much stronger storyline in terms of pipeline. We're moving away from this broader ask. I would say we're seeing successes in, this is maybe also stating the obvious, in sectoral adaptation planning. I invite colleagues who are looking at GCF readiness to look at not just subnational, but also sectoral, looking at potentially both. So we're doing sectoral plans in Laos. We've done a lot of provincial planning in Sri Lanka. And that helps to continue to bring your downscale projections down into a much more granular set of performance-related indicators, really where the adaptation challenges are to be found. And then moving very quickly into the challenges and opportunities. I guess we've talked a lot about data already. Maybe I'll talk about the institutional issues. We cannot do this translation work if the institutions are not working together. And I think if we're stepping outside of the vagaries of politics, we're seeing a lot of projects that are really slowed down because ministries are changing, they're restructuring, or they're changing leadership. So how do we extricate our progress and our work on these different and very important, crucial, I would say, not just mitigation, not just adaptation, but also mitigation, and putting them in a basket of resilience approaches that insulates what we're doing against as much as possible against politics. So setting up institutions which are in universities, which are in cities, which are in subnational governments, which keeps the momentum flowing as we're looking to downscale and looking to bring these indicators into practice. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And for giving us a lens when it comes to investments and implementation, also the finance lens on this as well. Moving on quickly to Julie, which is the implementation and also on finance. So we have 3 questions for Julie, which are how can GGA targets and indicators be integrated into NAP processes and national implementation systems? The second question is how can they support prioritization and development of investment pipelines? And the last question is what is needed to link monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems with finance and implementation? Over to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you. Very easy questions to answer in 2-3 minutes. But first off, thank you to the Secretariat for inviting me to speak here. Having worked on NAPs for over a decade, I'm very pleased that we now have indicators. A lot of countries have been asking for this to be able to design their own indicators, and this makes our work a lot easier now that we have these indicators, so thanks to the experts. So to shift from planning to implementation, I could not agree more with Mohammed that we need to tailor the country monitoring evaluation learning system. We need to tailor the GGA to the country's national systems. But because of the short time I was allocated, I will talk a little bit more about the investment part and the financing part and how the GGA indicators can help. As I mentioned, these indicators have been requested by countries for a long time, and we know in general in our work that smart indicators are a really strong pre-requirement for any investment and for any project to be bankable and investable. So turning NAPs into these investable pipelines of projects is required, and the way that the GGA indicators and targets can really help is by strengthening the confidence that investors can have in those projects. And they do so by, one, setting direction. So they show that project pipelines can address priority adaptation projects because they're stemming directly from the NAPs, and the NAPs would be aligned with the GGA indicators. So starting with that, from that continuum of policy to implementation, that priority setting and direction is really key for investors. A second way that the GGA can help is to provide clarity on expecting results. Of course, all the project pipelines and the log frame, etc., always had indicators, but having these standardized indicators, standardized metrics, really also helps in developing the confidence that projects have measurable outcomes, outputs, and results. A third way is that having these standardized metrics can really help supporting innovative financing, for instance, looking more into results-based or performance-based financing, which is a way in which a lot of projects are developing, and it can also support blended finance and other ways than pure grant-based financing. And fourth, overall, we know that by having a stronger evidence base and having that iterative learning that strong indicators can provide really helps in looking at what has worked, what hasn't worked, and that iterative process is also what gives more confidence and can really strengthen evidence-based decision-making. And that's where the L in MEL is important, the learning aspect, so that we feed this back into the process. And then on the third question, which was on how to link MEL systems and financing, I wanted to close with an example from our work, which is beyond projects. We talk a lot about projects, but actually what we really need in the NAP is to mainstream into development planning, as also Nick said, at national level, at sectoral level, at local level. And for that, you also need the link to budgeting. So UNDP has been working for a long time on climate budgeting. We've developed a whole series of tools and approaches that we support countries with. So for instance, in the Philippines, where they have a strong climate change typology, and where there's even been a circular that was joined between the Climate Commission and the Department of Budget, we are currently supporting the country in looking at whether the projects and different initiatives funded by the Ministry of Environment are aligned with the NAP to move towards more results-based monitoring of expenditures. And we're also in parallel through another project that so this is through UK funding from an initiative that we have at regional level called the Climate Finance Network, but we're also linking it to some other work we're doing with the Biofin project, which is a large initiative that is looking at biodiversity finance and looking at the dual benefits between climate and biodiversity to also strengthen that budget expenditure tagging and tracking that the Philippines has. And this is really so that eventually there's this alignment between the NAP, between the national monitoring systems, between the budget tagging system in the country. And all this eventually helps increase allocation to climate adaptation, increases policy coherence as well, and also helps the country comply with performance-based budgeting.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Julie. Those were very, very good insights when it comes to the investment perspective. Well, we're very pressed for time, so we were now going to go over into an interactive discussion. But since we have limited time, maybe I'll flip the questions to you guys. If you have any, maybe 2 burning questions for the panelists now on the floor, we open the floor to those questions. Okay, I see one. If you can come to the mic. If you could introduce yourself and who the question is directed at. Thank you.
My name is Ahsan Ali. I'm doctor in environmental and energy engineering. Actually, I'm just come here for the curiosity of learning regarding these things because I'm a climate specialist, but I'm on the scientific side more. So it was a very informative and interactive learning session for me. This is my first time here. I have a quick question. Maybe I lack in knowledge, but when you guys are discussing about the targets and their indicators, so I learned from their all the discussion, there are 11 targets and like 100 plus indicators. So whenever we discuss about the climate issues, so we usually break down our target in qualitatively, and then we put it into the quantitative analysis. So we are discussing so many things that indicators are transferred to the countries and to the local people, but we do not have any, I do not hear any specific target. Let's give it with an example. Like for CO2 emissions or fossil fuel burning, we have certain target, like we have to reduce our fossil fuel emission around 40% till 2030, and we have to obsolete all the fossil fuel up to 2050. So for like we have health targets, and there are several indicators in for their targets. So from my thinking, to properly execute, we should have some kind of quantification at where we are standing right now and how much we have to mitigate these kinds of issues in our global climate perspective. So I hope you get my question. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that question. I can also hand it over to the expert over there, who's Stinley. No. I don't know who wants to answer this question, but in an overall, just to give you a little bit of context, we are discussing the global goal on adaptation targets. So those are 7 thematic targets and 5 dimensional targets. So the 7 are divided into health, infrastructure, and so on. And then the 5 dimensional targets are based on the iterative adaptation cycle. And then from those, we also have 59 indicators that are coming, and like it's the outcome from every COP. So it's negotiated, and every country has then agreed to these. And these are the ones that we're trying to kind of apply from the national perspective to the regional perspective, and now that is aggregated up to the global perspective. But I don't know if you guys want to go maybe into his question.
I think you just repeated my question. You didn't answer. Yeah, I was asking about, when you set some targets, I know these targets are there. So what is the quantification of that targets? Like we should have some percentage, like at this level we are standing, and we have to mitigate these kind of thing, bring up to this level. Yeah. So what?
Carlos will answer your question.
Thank you so much for the space, and actually this shows also the benefit of creating these platforms to integrate a number of lenses and perspectives. Maybe just to complement to this point is that the nature of this global goal on adaptation, with complements, of course, the 1.5 and the goal on the finance targets. So unlike mitigation, which is based on the emission reductions, the 1.5, the GGA is not a single quantified global target, right? With that understanding, it's important to go back to the 7.1 article under the Paris Agreement, where actually it calls for enhancing the adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. So it's a multi-dimensional number, and that is a mix of indicators and narratives, of course, at the national, local level. So that's the magic of this framework and all the different elements that have been included together. So this invites, of course, for a sectorial approach that will collectively show the progress, but they are very unique in nature: water, food, health, and so on and so forth. So that's why it's very important to bring the coherence in the system and to have these discussions and this dialogue across the support structure. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Oh, Julie, please go ahead.
Just briefly to answer this, I think because those were adopted at global level, and we're talking now about tailoring them to the country context, of course, you're completely right that you need to have clear numbers, but the baseline would be set at the country level depending on their level of resilience. And the indicators, they provide for a number. I mean, they would say it's a percentage, etc., but the baseline needs to be done by the countries and assessed at the country level, and they can then decide what their target is based on their baseline.
Thank you so much, Julie. I think I'm just going to wrap up the session because we're already 5 minutes over time. So I think the key messages that we hear are there are strong interest in applying the GGA targets and indicators, but it differs from countries because they're at different stages. Key challenges when it relates to data systems, methodologies, and also institutional coordination. And we also, there's a clear need to test these approaches in practice and share lessons learned and strengthen these systems over time. There's also a strong demand for support, including technical guidance, capacity building, knowledge sharing, and of course, finance. These insights provide valuable input for the ongoing work of the Adaptation Committee and also the LEG. And I like to also highlight where we're moving from, so that the effectiveness of the GGA will depend on how these targets and indicators are applied, tested, and also refined over time. I thank you to all the participants here in this room, and I thank all the speakers for joining me on the stage as well and sharing their experiences. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon. Welcome back from coffee break. So let's resume the session. And welcome to the second technical session of the Regional NAP Expo for Asia Pacific region. Once again, let me introduce myself. I am Thile Namgyal from Bhutan, and I'm happy to moderate the session on behalf of the Least Developed Countries Expert Group. The session is called From Risk to Response, Applying Risk Pathways in National Adaptation Plans. So we have 2 hours in this session, and we will use most of the time in group exercises and discussion. Do we put the QR code back? Okay. Okay, so before we begin, can I request everybody to check in your presence here? The QR code is up on the screens. So we have 2 hours. We'll use that largely in group exercises, but before that we have some presentations on the risk pathways in the NAPs. Okay, did everyone get a chance to check in? There's some handouts on the tables also if you can't see the QR code. That's good. I hear there's a raffle with this also. So, all right. I think everyone seems to have got a chance to check in. Okay. So before we start, I want to just remind ourselves and briefly situate where this session sits in the program. The last session before coffee break was the targets and the indicators which were adopted at the last COP in Belém. And so that covered the thematic targets, the dimensional targets of the GGA, and how we're working towards it, and how progress will be tracked using those indicators. That session established the direction. So the targets and the indicators establish where we want to be and what we want to achieve. So we have till 2030 and beyond, right? So this session, now, asks the next question: how do we get there? How do we move from identifying hazards to designing plans that address the right problems for the right communities? The analytical step of connecting the hazard identification to an effective adaptation response is what risk pathways provide, and this is what this session is going to be about. The slide that you see here, you see the pathways, is where risk pathways sits in the broader framework. So we know that we have this iterative cycle. It shows the full logical chain for adaptation from the climate risk assessment to the risk pathways, all the way to financing, adaptation orchestration, then the MEL, monitoring and evaluation. Risk pathways is right at the center of this chain, and it is the analytical bridge between understanding the risk, climate risk, and designing effective adaptation responses. The experience, I think, or the countries the leg has found is that without this risk pathways assessment step, the plans tend to jump from hazard list straight to measures and skips the causal reasoning that should make that connection. The gap is common, and it is one of the reasons that adaptation measures sometimes miss the mark. The UNFCCC NAP technical guidelines was recently updated by the leg. I have a copy here. I think there's a limited set of copies outside. You can get a physical copy if you want that. Otherwise, you can also download it, I think get a PDF copy. And there's a link on the QR code there if you want the PDF copy. And the updated guidelines, updated, and the diagram captures that, the full process in there, and how the different elements of the NAP process connect to each other. So in this session, I'll be helping facilitate the group exercise and the discussions later. But first, Ahmed from the Secretariat will walk us through the conceptual framework and some worked examples of how this risk assessment takes place. Ahmed?
Thank you, Henley, for setting the scene. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmed Abdul Fattah. I'm not sure I've met many of you. I'm with the UNFCCC Secretariat supporting the LDC Expert Group and National Adaptation Plans. So I would like to provide a brief introduction to the risk pathways approach, what it is, how it works, and what it looks like in practice through a few worked examples. By the end, you should have a good enough picture to apply it yourselves in group exercises. Let me start with a point that is simple but often overlooked when we design adaptation plans, and that is that climate hazards do not alone explain climate risk. The same cyclone produces very different outcomes depending on where it lands. If it hits a coastal town with good drainage, reinforced housing, and a working early warning system, the damage is contained. But if it hits a low-lying informal settlement with none of those things, the damage is severe. The hazard is the same, but the risk is completely different. So if we want to design adaptation plans that actually work, we need to understand more than just which hazards a country faces. We need to understand who and what is exposed, what conditions make certain communities more vulnerable than others, and how impacts can move and affect systems. Because food, water, health, and livelihoods do not sit in separate boxes, and they reinforce and affect each other with cascading effects. This is what a risk pathway helps us do. It traces the causal chain from the hazard all the way through to the wider consequence for society. You can see the 5 components here: the hazard, exposure, vulnerability driver, impact, and systematic consequence. So we will go through each of these on the next slide. Once you can trace that chain clearly, 3 things become easier. Identifying what an adaptation plan needs to address, understanding who needs to be involved, and seeing how a plan can respond to each part of the chain rather than only the surface problem. A hazard list tells you what is coming, but a pathway tells you why it produces harm the way that it does and where you can act on it. So what is a risk pathway? A risk pathway is a causal chain. It shows how a climate hazard leads through exposure and vulnerability to an impact and then to a wider systemic consequence. It helps countries do 3 things: understand why impacts occur, diagnose where climate risk is concentrated, and identify where interventions are possible. So let me walk through the 5 components. We start with the hazard, the climate event itself: a drought, intense rainfall, a heat wave, a tropical cyclone. This is typically where most adaptation planning starts. Next is exposure. Who or what is in harm's way? This could be a farming community, a stretch of coastline, an urban settlement, or critical water infrastructure. Exposure tells you which people and systems are actually in the path of the hazard. Then vulnerability drivers, the pre-existing conditions that turn exposure into serious harm. These could be a lack of early warning systems, dependence on a single crop, lack of access to insurance, weak infrastructure. These conditions are not caused by the climate event itself, but they determine how severely it lands and impacts communities. Fourth is impact, the direct harm that results: crop failure, damaged housing, contaminated water, lost fishing equipment. And fifth, systemic consequence, the wider effect on society: food insecurity, displacement, loss of livelihoods, long-term strain on public services. What makes the risk pathways logic useful is not just naming these 5 components, but tracing the connections between them. It explains why a problem occurs and where it can be interrupted. Once you can see the full pathway, you can begin to understand where adaptation interventions can make the most difference. And that is not always at the hazard end. Let me make this concrete with an example. So this is a complete drought pathway, and I want to walk through it step by step before we move to the worked examples where some boxes are left blank, and I want you to consider how you would fill it. The hazard is seasonal drought, reduced or absent rainfall over an extended period. The exposure is rain-fed farming areas, not all agricultural land, but specifically farms that depend entirely on rainfall because they have no irrigation. That is who is in the path of this drought. The vulnerability drivers are 2 conditions working together: dependence on one crop and low irrigation access. Dependence on a single crop means that there's no fallback if that crop fails. Low irrigation means that there's no buffer when the rain does not come. Together, they concentrate the risk. The impact is crop failure and reduced yields, and the systemic consequence is food insecurity and income loss, which can ripple further into rural debt, migration pressure, and strain on social protection systems. Now, notice what this gives us that a hazard list does not. It's not just drought causes food insecurity. It tells us in this specific context, drought causes food insecurity because there is no irrigation and because farmers depend on a single crop. Those are the conditions that need to change. Those are the entry points for adaptation. If you only had the hazard and jumped straight to a response, you might propose drought forecasting or drought-tolerant seeds. Useful, but they address the hazard and the impact. They don't touch on the underlying risk, the vulnerability drivers. If you trace the full pathway, other responses come into view. Expanding small-scale irrigation, supporting crop diversification, strengthening income support. Same hazard, same country, but the response looks very different depending on how far along the chain you look. Before we get into worked examples, let me briefly cover what we want you to take away from this session. So there are 4 objectives for this session, and they build on each other. By the end, you should be able to explain what a risk pathway is and how it fits within the NAP process, which we've just started to cover. You should be able to quickly apply risk pathway logic to a real country or sectoral context. And we will do that together in the worked examples, and then you'll do it yourselves in some group exercises. And you should be able to assess where climate risk is concentrated and why impacts occur. The same hazard does not produce the same risk everywhere, and the pathway helps you see why. And you should be able to describe how risk pathways can inform the design and updating of adaptation plans, so that when you return to your country process, you have a practical approach to draw on. So let us now work together on 2 examples. I'll walk through the reasoning before the answers are revealed, so you have a chance to think along. So our first worked example is intense rainfall in the context of food systems. The hazard on the left and the systemic consequence on the right are already filled in. The 3 boxes in the middle are blank. As I walk through this, think about what you would put in those boxes for your own country context. The hazard is intense rainfall, so heavy concentrated precipitation over a short period, which often leads to flash flooding, very common in the Asia-Pacific region. The systemic consequence in this case would be food shortage and loss of income, and that is the outcome that we're working backwards from. Now the 3 blank boxes in the middle. For exposure, who or what is in harm's way? The slide offers some examples, such as homes built near riverbanks, roads and bridges in low-lying areas, flood-prone smallholder farms. Think about your own context. When intense rainfall hits a food system, who is most exposed? Communities whose supply routes get cut off when roads flood, farmers on lowland plains near rivers. For vulnerability drivers, the things that make it worse, you might think about the absence of an early warning system, so farmers cannot protect assets or livestock in time, lack of crop insurance, so a single event wipes out a season's income, or dependence on a single crop. Weak drainage infrastructure and insecure land tenure are also worth considering, as they shape whether households can invest in protective measures at all. For impact, how this leads to harm, you might think of damage to homes and storage, contaminated water sources, loss of livestock, or crops destroyed before they can be harvested. Even without a full country diagnostic, thinking through these questions tells you a lot about where adaptation needs to act and who needs to be involved. The Meteorological Service for early warning, the Agricultural Ministry for insurance and diversification, local government for drainage, finance ministries for social protection. So let us look at one sample response for this pathway. So here's one way that the pathway could be filled in. It's not the only correct answer. Different countries would fill this entirely differently, and that is the point. The hazard is intense rainfall. The exposure, in this case, is lowland farmland, where water accumulates when heavy rain arrives and where food system is most directly at risk. The vulnerability drivers are poor drainage and no flood barriers. Without drainage, water sits on the fields. Without barriers, there's nothing keeping the water out. And these are the conditions that turn exposure into serious harm. The impact is crop damage. And the systemic consequence is food shortage and loss of income. Notice how clear the causal logic is. You can see why the impact happens, not simply because rain falls, but because it falls on farmland that has no way of shedding the water. And once you have named the vulnerability drivers clearly, you can also see where adaptation needs to act. Drainage is an infrastructure and local government issue. Flood barriers require investment and physical planning. Neither of those is a meteorological issue, even though the hazard itself is. That is what a hazard list alone cannot give you. So let us now look at a more complex case where often we have 2 hazards arriving together and with cascading effects. So this second example involves a compound hazard. Tropical cyclone combined with storm surge, and we're looking at coastal livelihoods in this case. Compound hazards matter because in reality, hazards rarely arrive one at a time, particularly in this region. As the note on the slide says, 2 or more hazards can cascade together, so we use them as a combined starting point for a single pathway. Both hazards feed into the same chain. On the far right, the systemic consequence is already filled in, the collapse of coastal livelihoods. The 3 boxes in the middle are blank. For exposure, who or what is in harm's way, the slide gives examples such as community water supply infrastructure and housing and water facilities in low-lying coastal areas. Think about who actually lives and works in those zones. Fishing households, communities whose entire livelihoods depend on access to the sea and on functioning infrastructure. For vulnerability drivers, what makes it worse, you might consider limited backup water supply options, inadequate construction standards in coastal zones, the absence of safe harbors or fishing boats, or insecure land tenure that limits access to formal recovery support after a disaster. For impact, how the harm unfolds, think about damage to water treatment and distribution systems, and loss of fishing equipment and boats. Here is where the compound nature of this hazard matters. The cyclone alone might damage boats. The storm surge alone might contaminate walls. Together, they do both simultaneously, and they also cut off the roads that would allow clean water and repair crews to reach affected communities. The outcome is not simply the sum of 2 separate events, it is the result of them compounding. So let us look at one sample response for this pathway. So again, the hazards are tropical cyclone and storm surge, arriving together and reinforcing each other. The exposure is fishing communities, not coastal areas in general, but the communities whose livelihoods are directly tied to the sea. Their homes, their boats, and their income are all located at the coast. The vulnerability driver is high poverty levels. I want to spend a moment on this. Poverty is what makes the same hazard hit these communities harder than others. It means housing that cannot withstand the storm, no savings or insurance, and no alternative source of income. It means that when fishing gear is lost, it cannot be quickly replaced. It's one vulnerability driver that sits underneath many specific weaknesses. The impact in this case is displacement of fishing communities. People who have to leave because their homes, their boats, and their source of income are all gone at once. And the systemic consequence is collapse of coastal livelihoods. Not a temporary setback, but a structural loss of the livelihood base for entire communities. So 2 things worth noting before I hand over back to Tinley. First, the key vulnerability driver here, poverty, is not a climate issue, for example. It is a development issue. But it determines whether this hazard produces a recoverable disruption or a collapse. This is exactly the point of the risk pathways approach. Second, naming poverty as the vulnerability driver tells you something important about who needs to be involved in the adaptation response. Social protection systems, livelihood diversification programs, and poverty reduction policy all become part of the conversation. That is not only a climate or disaster management issue, but much broader. And the approach is the same across both examples, flooding and compound cyclone, but the pathways are completely different. Different exposures, different vulnerability drivers, different impacts, even in cases where there might be the same hazard to begin with. That is what you'll be working on and constructing in your groups shortly, ideally drawing on your own country context and looking at different sectors. So with that, I'll stop here and let me hand over back to Tinley to introduce the group activity. We have provided worksheets, which we will distribute once he's explained, but thank you for your engagement.
Thank you, Ahmed. So I hope that provided a clear picture of what a risk pathway is. The causal chain from hazard through exposure and vulnerability, leading to the overall impact and systemic consequence, which helps us identify the specific entry points for adaptation at each stage. So we've seen that one same hazard can lead, whether it's drought, flooding, or cyclone, can produce very different consequences based on the exposure, who's exposed, and the conditions that they're in, the vulnerability. So that context specificity is exactly what this group exercise is designed to surface. And I'm sure if you read about the GGA indicators also, it says context is really important. From the Maldives also, you've seen that previous session, so the context is really important. So who's exposed, what is their vulnerability is going to be key. So I think this risk exercise is going to be important for adaptation, and I think the rest of the sessions going on forward as well. So now we will move to the group exercises, and it's your turn to apply this approach using the same structure that we just saw. The pathways are here, so there's different groups. I'm not sure if we have enough participants to fill all groups. So looking at the group here, the number of people here, I think maybe we can have 3 groups, I think, or maybe 3 groups, yeah? I think maybe 3 groups, so we can have, so I was asking left, right, and center, so everybody's included. So the left side, right side, and center maybe can come to one table, I think. So we have 3 tables, enough space. The templates are going to be handed out, but I think there's also, if you want the electronic one, the QR code is there. You can work on that. Elect a rapporteur in your group, and usually I think when it's a big NAP Expo, you have enough people from different countries sitting together, or regions, it's easy to identify common ones. So maybe try and figure out, pick a country or a region and figure out which situation you want to talk about the exposure and vulnerability. So you'd have to exercise some scenarios that way and work on it. This is just an exercise. So pick a pathway for each scenario. Fill all 5 components: the hazard, exposure, vulnerability drivers, impact, and systemic consequences. So I think we'll have about 30 minutes. Yeah. So if you have questions, there'll be the secretariat people, and we'll be walking around as well. So further clarifications if you need. There's flip charts, I think sheets on the table, and if you want to work electronically, the QR code is there for the templates. So 30 minutes. Anything else you want to add?
Since we have here considered 5 different themes, perhaps we can just focus on 3 if there's a preference, but let's say water security, food, agriculture, and health, unless anyone would prefer one of the other 2. But so in that case, are there any interests for one of the 3 themes? By show of hands? Yeah, let's say for water security. Is there anyone who's particularly interested in water security as opposed to agriculture and food or health? Okay, if there are no preferences, we can just assign to the 3 groups. That's okay. What do you? Water. Okay, good. Water security, group 1. In the center, and then on the right we have food and agriculture. Great. And then on the left we will do health. I will be distributing the worksheets in a minute.
Are you okay? You want to do health? You can choose something else if you want as well. You can choose any of the other remaining ones, up to you. too well. do this.
Mokona will do a full presentation.
Okay.
Should we just moderate Jamshi?
So exercise you do.
Ngajena Yusuf the Paul with pura interactive. Fully interactive singe ma presentation ei nahi sa. Only single is
Context
context go hai lagi the
examples to get the thinking going.
oh the direct पर बहुत में तो कभी zoom लगी था सीधे लब को वो लगता है. Yeah, this is the one. To summarize to some and once they finish the presentation. Navagi.
2.2 again, 46.
This is the one that is probably this one will have running notes like they'll send you Genius for updating it. But this is the work cafe of different settings that you have to move around. Hot testing is it. Hopefully. I don't know how Achala will take it, but director level they will not explain things and just up for it hopefully. This is Carlos beside. Last.
Charles, return train ticket kada.
Oh God, mine is at 5 a.m. in the morning.
Evening in the morning.
They told us there's no train tickets on in the evening.
Who told?
Our West stores, who else? Sold out. But in Yogi Bewaji, go to a station before that Kwamyong station or whatever. It's the same thing. From there, you have to take a cab anyway to go wherever you want to go. To your hotel, you're going to stay.
Trip to Hong Kong plus like this. I want to book. I want to leave that evening and I'm back now for another vision. Let's see. I'm looking to book you.
It's stolen is but it's still like living as after 6 is like another 3 years. 3 years run update. I think 3 hours. Can we wrap up in 1 minute, please? And then I think some groups are already done.
We're using that example that you are at that level.
Are we ready to come back? Or are you having too much fun? So 2 minutes, if we can wind up, we need to finish on time. All right, I have to start chasing you. Sorry to stop your fun. So who's going to be presenting from each group? We'll do one by one. All right, I think the groups are ready, right? If you can bring your outputs over here. Which group is health? Okay, so health group, we have a chart. What about the other groups? Do we have anything to present? Okay, there's a table. Are we ready? Ahmed, is your group ready? Yeah? Okay. So welcome back. So we'll do a report back, I think, from the groups. And for the camera, I think they need to be able to see it. So you can come up here to this microphone one by one. I'll call on you. So we already have health here. So I'll ask each group to share just one pathway, not necessarily all three. Choose one which was the most interesting, I think, most illustrative that you think would be useful. Limited to 2 or 3 minutes for the presentation so we can hear from everyone. And as you listen, just keep in mind, how does the same hazard produce different consequences depending on who is exposed and how vulnerable and in what way? What patterns are emerging across the groups? Are the vulnerability drivers the same regardless of the sector? And where do the intervention points overlap or diverge? So just keep that in mind. It's a good exercise to have. So can I invite a representative from the health group to come up and present the output?
Thank you. I'm Sarin from UNU, and our group discussed about the impact pathway of health, and I will introduce about the hazard with heat wave and flooding, just because it was the first pathway, and we had quite comprehensive and long discussions on this pathway. So the first exposure would be the most exposed communities would be vulnerable groups and the most densely populated cities and villages. And we also discuss about different types of vulnerable communities, such as disabled people or people who is under social protection, which has lower income than average population. And secondly, the vulnerability drivers would include poverty and type of housing and whether it's closer to coastal line or etc. And then also type of jobs who are most exposed to outdoor activities. And of course, weak sanitation infrastructures or access to electricity and energy in general, and also limited health facilities and access to them. And for the impact part, of course, people will physically get injured, and people are more vulnerable to disease because it's about health. And then we also discuss about mental health. I think this is some kind of topic and aspect which is not under discussed. And then what we have discussed, yes, and also we discussed about a bit a weak system or governance, such as inability to coping with the health, such as institutional capacity of health authorities. And also the impacts would be lost days in labor and consequently decrease of income and also displacement due to the hazards. And we actually discussed about a bit more systemic consequences. So this is not only reflecting the general population health, but also it affects macroeconomic level income and countries' GDP or economy status. I think the most interesting part was that we discussed about other hazards, but we could see what are the between hazards and systemic risk and consequences, and also we could find that there are like common aspects of the most vulnerable people and the most dominating impacts under the topic of health. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you to the health group. So maybe we can come down to the center group.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a working group 2, focus on water. We misunderstood, so we work on all the pathway. So 1, 2, 3, we all work on that. But I think now as you instructed, that we will only present one pathway. So based on the group discussion, I think we will focus on drought and saltwater intrusion. So the exposure, based on the group discussion, the group recommended that the exposure might be low-income households. When we have a water insecurity, then we have a low-income households, and also affect to small-scale farmers and water quality and quantity. So that's these 3 points are part of the exposure. And then the main vulnerability drivers, poverty, inadequate water supply, lack of technology, and weak of regulatory monitoring. So these are the vulnerability issues if water is in security. And then the impact, health problems, and also malnutrition, crop failure, also public health issues, and lack of productive land. And the systematic consequences, I think, already provided by the presenters. I think I don't need to repeat. So these are the result of the group discussion. But we also cover pathway 2 and 3. So if other colleague wants to see what we have discussed, I think you can also cross-check with this. We didn't write it in the flip chart, but we have all the details here. So I think Secretariat can take it and maybe put together all information under the link so that everyone can access. Thank you.
Thank you to the water group. So sorry to push you all you had rich discussions in your group, but we're forcing you to present really succinctly. So let's move to food and agriculture.
My name is Dviti, and I'm going to discuss about the erratic rainfall and drought. So first is the exposure. So what is exposed is agricultural lands and farmlands due to drought and heavy rainfall. Farmlands like cotton, millet, groundnut, rice, low-lying areas are exposed. Vulnerability drivers are the lack of capital, lack of economic resources, lack of alternatives, and lack of irrigation. Impacts are failure of crop, reducing income, and the systematic consequences are migration, inflation, food insecurity, land conversion, and malnutrition. Thank you.
That was really succinct. All right, so I think it was probably a good exercise based on, I think, the discussions the groups had, regardless of coming from different backgrounds and different, I think, contexts. So the point of the exercise was not just to go from saying we have this hazard and then come to a impact and a solution immediately. It's who is exposed, how are they exposed, what are the underlying conditions, and how do we address this in a holistic manner. So the interventions, and you find the entry points and what should be addressed. I think that you would find that there's do this more and more, you'll find there's common themes and different linkages you can make later. And when you do the adaptation later, you have to draw those, I think, the connections together when you have the storyline and how to approach it in a more holistic manner. So let's open up the floor for broader discussions on what you think this means about the NAP and any reflections, general, or if you have questions for the other groups. So we'll open this up for maybe 5 minutes or so. Any further reflections? Any further reflections or questions? You had enough discussions already? All right. So basically, I think the point of the exercise was to really go beyond just doing the simplistic manner. The lessons learned, the NAPs is an iterative manner. We started from the NAPAs, short-term urgent, then we're now moving to medium, long-term in the NAPs. Now we're being informed by the GGA and the targets. What gets measured gets done is the key thing. That's why we have now the indicators. We heard from the previous sessions that the indicators were long awaited by the different countries. From the panel that we had also, we said that we heard that it's welcome, that it helps make a good, strong evidence case on how we move forward, measure what we need to do. And having the right indicators, having the right entry points is going to be key. If you have the wrong indicators, we measure the wrong things and do the wrong things. So even finding the right risk pathways is the point of this exercise. That the hazard list alone is not going to be enough. So that what is going to be coming, and then we heard previously saying how do we translate the difficult technical matters to make it relevant to communities and the vulnerable groups. From all the common things I heard was vulnerable groups, the low income, the ones who have the least means, was at least in the small sampling of the exercise that we had here. The last thing to close, I think we can probably close now, right? I think to close, it's so to move away. It's lastly 3 things, is that the risk pathways is not only that shows what harm is occurring, but why, through what sequence of cause and effects, and what are the underlying, how do we address not just the symptoms, but the underlying risks. Number two is that the same hazard can produce different outcomes depending on who is exposed and what conditions they are living under. And there is no generic adaptation solution. So the context specificity, we heard that from the Maldives and some others as well. So the same hazard, different locations, different communities needs different solutions and different interventions. Third, that for well-constructed pathways, we need to make clear what adaptation needs to achieve and who needs to act, again, based on the risk pathways. Who are the different actors you can identify? So that makes the plans more targeted, more accountable, and easier. I think there's some of the words we already saw in the previous sessions as well. So the NAP Expo sessions in the next few days will build on this foundation, the risk pathways, moving from risk diagnosis towards the responses, functions, and the implementation strategies. So to conclude, thank you all for your active engagement today. We know it's a little far away physically, not so far, but far enough from the main Expo Center. Thank you for your active engagement today. The next technical session on adaptation measures and the functions to address the systematic consequences we discussed will take place tomorrow here in the same room from 2 o'clock to 3:30. So thank you again and come back tomorrow.